This is our second session of Romans, and we'll be covering chapter 1 for those of you joining us on the recording. So we're going to do two things today, and I decided as I prepared, I was getting into two. I was hoping to cover 1 and 2, but as I dug into 1 deeper, and the more I got into it, the more I just felt like, I'd rather this is an issue in the church, in particular as we get into the second half. And around homosexuality, but I don't think homosexuality is really the issue. I think and we'll talk about that. I think it is a part of the whole. But really, what happens is you have kind of two parts, and we're going to read through this. We can go around. I'll ask everyone. Let me see. There are one, two. There's too many of us, but we can. If you'd like to read a couple passage or a couple verses, what we'll have you do is I'll invite someone to read. We'll all listen together so we can hear from the version they're reading from. If you would like to read, and then we will go through verse by verse and word by word, and I'll point out some things, and we can talk, and I'll ask some questions. So I will be asking you. I'm not trying. My questions. I'm not trying to debate you and answer. Just to then turn around and give you the right answer, because I don't necessarily ever know if there's one of these are right answers. But what I can do is give you some things to think about and what Paul is doing. And I just have a few notes, and I think as we get on, the theology of it all will kick in. Do ask questions. Do consider the words that are in your text. Just real quickly, as we go around, just name the version you're reading. We'll start with Ken. NIV. Al, you got NRSV.
NRSV.
I thought you had Message.
No, I didn't bring it.
Oh,
you don't like it.
It doesn't make a difference. It's still a version.
I didn't bring it.
Ron, bring it next week.
No.
You can bring them both. It's good. NIV.
NLT?
And
New Living Testament?
New Living Testament. Yeah, the New Living Translation.
Okay.
NIV. What do you got over here?
King James.
King James. How about online? Chris and Linda, what do you got? Denny?
NIV. NIV.
Jim and Glenda?
I have NIV, Contemporary English Version, or the Message.
Okay, Dave, what are you reading?
I think it's King James.
Okay, so we got about 3 or 4 versions, and we're not going to have a huge variance in some of these things, and the messages are not going to change. So typically, what you hear is going to be able to apply in some ways. The words may be different, but again, that goes back to the fact that it's not always easy to piece it together. But I think parallel Bibles are great in that regard because you get a sense of where the different translations are. But what we see in this really is a couple major sections. The first is kind of, I think if you divide it from the broadest perspective, it would be 1 through 17 and 18 to 32. 1 through 17 could be considered his sort of beginnings, his salutation, his prologue. He's introducing some stuff, and we're going to go through, and that can be broken up into 3 sections. And then he goes into this second part, and he dives right in. So remember what we talked about last week, the context. He doesn't know them, and we're going to see that here. He's writing to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles. He is writing to a church that has recently had all of the Jews and Jewish Christians in Rome removed, and so they were left with Gentile Christians who kind of ruled the roost for 5-ish, probably 6-ish years. And I mean, it's not like you just jump on a flight and come back to to Rome. So there was a transition both in and out, and as the Jewish Christians came back, things had changed. And so there's tensions, and Paul would be aware of these tensions and would have been aware of some of the nuances of that. The first section that we're going to look at, which is 1 to 17, as I said, is divided into 3 sections. And I'm going to get to these a little bit in a second. But 1 to 7 is considered a salutation, or where he greets, and he makes some comments that we'll go through around his identity, around the proof, or what I would say, the proof being the prophecy of who Jesus was. He talks about Jesus himself, and we'll come back to these, and he talks about his purpose for writing. And then if you're, if you're sort of trying to break it down in your notes or anything, or how you're thinking, and then 8 through 15, my guess is if, and your Bibles probably break these through, mine does in this way too. But most people, but the NRSV actually represents what probably the vast majority of them generally, there's not a lot of division in how these are broken up. And then 8 through 15 is sort of deals with 8 through 15 is a prayer of thanksgiving. And he gets in and he starts to get into some of the theology of why he's writing. And he also speaks to the audience. And then 16 and 17 is a sort of his first all-encompassing statement. And then he sort of gets into the deeper theology of it. There isn't a lot of controversy around any of this part being added or subtracted or redacted, or what you have here is by and large here in the fullest version, but remember there was 14, 15, and 16, and that 14 version, chapter version, was the most common, and they didn't have some of the salutations and things. And again, you could take off this whole, or the first part of this first chapter, and then a few other verses throughout the book of Romans, and you could give it to someone and it wouldn't have any sort of, this is to who or not to who. And then we'll get into the second part. A couple things just about it. Of all of Paul's writings, this is the longest salutation. It's the most elaborate. It's the most eloquent. It's the most grand. And I think, again, we have to consider the fact that they didn't know him. They would have heard of him. There was not that familiar sense of the church that I planted. How have you been? I've really missed you, sending my love to you. This is something that, again, is spoken to as if he was writing to a church that he was anticipating, and he knows that they've heard of him, but not in the sense of a personal. So he has to take some preliminary steps. His salutation that we get in 1 through 7 follows a typical Greco-Roman introduction. Meaning that it starts with the sender's identification of the senders, and then it goes to the recipients, and then it goes to a brief greeting. And you see that in the beginning, and you can also see that in the verses that were listed in terms of that were Acts, if you care. I'm not going to look them up, but if you want to look them up yourself and see the comparison, Acts 15:23. Thessalonians 1:1 and James 1:1 would be an example of Greco-Roman salutations that sort of match this. All right, let's with that I'll save for the rest of it for each section that I want to kind of touch on. But let's start. Is it just by show of hands, and I'll just call you out when I need you? Is anyone really interested in reading today? You need to be able to read loud so that everyone online can hear you. Anyone? Anyone online really want to read? I'm fine with also reading it. We're not reading too much. No one with a grand desire to read?
Sure.
All right. Ron, why don't you give us the whole thing, 1 through 7, nice and loud,
Okay.
as if you were Paul.
Paul, the servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God, with power according to the Spirit of holiness by resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for the sake of his name, including yourselves, who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. To all God's beloved in Rome, who are called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, so perfect, thanks. And what you have there, did you see that? You see the introduction of who he is. You see all the way down to 7, to all God's beloved in Rome. These are the recipients. And then you see, and it's mixed a little bit here. The greeting, I would say, actually spills into the next section as well. But let's go through, and what I want to do is point out a few things, and we'll go verse by verse. But before I do, actually, we'll go. Where does that sentence end? I'll read a passage, or I'm going to read a section of this passage, and then I want to give you an opportunity before I chime in just to see if there's something that stands out to you. And again, I'll spin the camera around if it comes. I think they can still see you in line, but Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Let's stop there. What do you hear? Anything? And if you don't have anything, that's fine. I'm happy to chime in, but I just want to give you a chance, as you've read this, to kind of, if there's something you noted in your reading or your study that stands out to you. Anything? Go
He
ahead.
was willing to be a servant.
Willing to be a servant. All right, I'm going to count to 3 in my head, and if no one responds, I'm going to jump in here. So Paul identifying the name, and then he identifies himself in 2 ways, and this is about Paul's identity, and this is important because, again, this is the sender. So he names himself a servant of Jesus Christ, and this is an important motif all the way through the Gospels. Jesus says we're the greatest, we are called to be a servant of all. Christ was the greatest servant of all. The notion of a servant, I just want to say as an aside, is something that we have lost. It's something that really outside of the church, we don't really use the term servant, partly because of our history as a nation and with slaves and servants. So people are a little gun shy around that. But even the cleaning lady that comes in, you don't call them your servants because that has this pejorative tone to it. But yet we find in Scripture this throughout, and this is the exact word that Christ is referring to, and he does it intentionally. He's not saying servant isn't just a helper in the house. He's saying servant in the sense of the lowliness of the status of a servant, because it's trying to make a point that this is the very thing we're called. This goes back to the whole cosmology of this is not our world. And if it's not our world, we're not meant to be exalted. We're meant to be servant. It's the upside down kingdom. And Christ infuses this in everything. And and they just created in the PCUSA, they just created a whole new office of leadership to develop leadership. And one of my big beefs with young adult and youth ministry over the years has been across the board, in every denomination, in every tradition, and in schools across the board, we're always talking about developing leaders. But quite frankly, not everyone is a leader, nor can everyone be a leader. You can't have everyone in this room leading. We can take turns leading, but then the designation shifts, and the next person is we yield our judgment to the leader, or we yield our, the schedule to the leader, or whatever it might be. And I think this is the challenge of the notion. He's not saying I, a leader of Jesus Christ, or a teacher in Jesus Christ. He's saying I, a servant in Jesus Christ. Because that sense of servitude is so central to the gospel. It's the very first 3 words. Paul, a servant. We don't talk about to our kids about serve. This is why I drill into Silas again and again. We are called to serve. And so that is where we find our community, not in leadership, but in service, because everyone here can be a servant. Not everyone can be a leader. And so it is an accessibility point for everybody, so that everyone can enter. So Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, and then he goes into the second phrase, called to be an apostle. Now this is important that he's identifying. You know how you go, it's kind of like you want to go in and you want to make sure everyone knows where you're coming from. And he's not claiming apostolic succession from hanging out with Jesus. That would be, it would be false. He has to have a sense of he is identifying why he's in this game, why he's leading, why he's a leader at this time. So called, and if you would have read his other books, and by point the folklore around him or the stories around him, I'm sure would have been spread far and wide. Called to be an apostle, but that's a huge claim.
Jason,
Yes.
would he ever consider himself, or did any of them just consider themselves as strictly a scribe, a one to save the word?
I don't know of anyone other than those who maybe have written or been transcribing in the New Testament apostleship to consider themselves scribes. In part, there would be connotations around Judaism of what a scribe was, because that was actually not just someone who wrote something, it was an official designation. It's like the historian or the, the scholar around that. And none of the apostles were, I mean, Luke is probably the closest thing we have to a scholar. He was a doctor of medicine, so he was educated. But no, I mean, despite the fact that they were writing these things, if anything, then Timaeus or whatever his name was, the guy or the person, I don't remember names ever, the guy who was transcribing, this would be the person who would be most Tertius would be the scribe in this. But even then, not in the Hebrew sense, and that would have been, to the Jews, they would hear that as a record. I mean, to the Gentiles, they hear as a record keeper. To the Jews, that would be like a very confusing term because they have an association with it. So, no, an apostle, though, it implies a certain closeness. The Apostles' Creed, this is the essence. These are those who traveled. Paul did not travel, so he has to have the designation. He was called to be apostle. And then he goes into the second phrase, set apart for the gospel of God. I'm getting a little feedback. So I would the audio is not on that, so it shouldn't come through. For those of you online, if you're able, if you're going to speak, on mute. But if not, maybe go ahead and mute because I just keep getting that feedback, and I don't know if it's being recorded. Thank you. Set apart for the gospel of God. There again, set apart. What do we know that means? Holy, righteous, set apart, claimed by God. But not just like the Jews who were set apart, who were made holy by the righteousness. He was set apart for a purpose. So in this first sentence, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, there's a lot in there. One, he identifies himself with Christ's calling to be a servant. Two, he identifies himself with the authority of the apostles. And three, he identifies that he is set out for a purpose, and that is to proclaim the gospel of God. Anyone want to say anything about that? Any comments, thoughts? Okay. Verse 2, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So here's an interesting thing. One, Paul is not writing Scripture. He's not referring to the Gospels. He is talking about the Old Testament Torah. He's talking about the Jewish Torah. And he is validating the gospel of God. That phrase, gospel of God, is set apart, in which he promised beforehand. So he is set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So what's promised beforehand in the prophets, in the Old Testament or in the Jewish Scriptures? The gospel of God. So he's identifying this isn't a new news. This isn't like some spontaneous news. It's not like an alien ship came down there like, surprise, we have something new for you today. This is something that was anticipated. This is something that they wanted. And Jews at the time would have been struggling with this. Is Jesus the Son of God? And did the gospel that John the Baptist and Jesus brought forth, was it actually valid good news? Or was it mistaken that this was a false prophet? Okay, anything on that? 3. Okay, verse 3, the gospel, he goes back to identifying it. What is the gospel of God? Well, the gospel concerning his son, and now this is an important, we capitalize the S because they're referring to Jesus, the gospel concerning his son. So now he takes the idea of the good news of salvation, which is a part of Jewish prophecy, is a part of Jewish anticipation, that there would be a reconciliation, there would be some sense of salvation, but now identifies it with a person, that the good news is found in Christ. And then he goes on as a qualifier to say, who is a descendant from David according to the flesh. And then it ends with that one chapter, or in verse, I'm going to do that all night. With verse 3, a descendant from David according to the flesh. Now, here's what's important to note. Paul knows he's writing both to Jews and Gentiles. So he's addressing, and he does this all through Romans, we'll point it out, the Jews-Gentile dichotomy. He is right, and it's kind of like, well, in today's sort of political climate, it's like if you're writing to both Democrats and Republicans, or you're writing to, a mixed, either or. It's a challenge. When you're trying to straddle the gap between something, between two different perspectives, he does this throughout. And you're going to see that, and we'll point it out again and again. So he first starts with a statement that is designed for the ears of the Jews. Because quite frankly, the Gentiles don't care. I mean, we do now, in retrospect, because it's history and we understand how it all fits together. But for those hearing the first, it would be like, well, I don't, that was just the history of it. That's not really important to me, but it is. But they wouldn't have necessarily heard this. So descendant from David according to the flesh. And then verse 4, and was declared to be the Son of God. And you could say that was declared in a variety of ways, but you could trace that all the way back both from his birth, where the angel declared. You could do that from his naming when he was named Emmanuel. You could do that from when Simeon saw him and said, I've wanted my eyes to see. You could do that when the rabbis identified that he had something special at 12. But you could do it most quintessentially and most profoundly when he was baptized. The verse we looked at a few weeks ago, when he came out of the water and Christ said, this is my beloved in whom I am well pleased. This is my son. And so he identifies and he claims him to be the Son of God with power. So it's not just his son on earth. It's not like David. David didn't have any special powers. David was an earthly king chosen by God. So Paul is diving into the idea the Son of God had power according to the Spirit. So there you go. So now he has a statement for the Jews and a statement for the Gentiles. He was declared to be the Son of God with the power according to the Spirit of holiness. Some of my passage here has a small s. Some of you may have a note in that, or you may have a capital S. It could be either or, depending on, it really doesn't make a difference. But according to the Spirit, I would probably capitalize if I was translating, because I think it's referring to the Holy Spirit. But because it's a spirit of, and it's a smaller sort of designation, Spirit of holiness is kind of like the Spirit of healing. There are those that think that some of the spirits that come out of Christ are the spirit of, and they're not lesser spirits, but they're just not the Spirit. It's kind of like when you say the church, you mean the whole church. And when you write a church, of a type, you would put it in a smaller c. By the Spirit of resurrection from the dead. So what he's doing there is he is saying both in an earthly, fleshly sense, he is the Son of God. But when he was resurrected through the Spirit of holiness, being made completely set apart, completely designated. Now Christ is resurrected in this new body from the dead, and then he names exactly who he's talking about in case there's any confusion. Jesus Christ our Lord. Let's stop there at the end of 4. Thoughts, comments? Okay. Verse 5, through whom we have received grace and apostleship. So now they identify Christ in all of the nomenclature and all of the titles and all of the designations, both for Jews and Gentile, whom we have received the grace, and this is with the theme of the whole book, is grace. And apostleship is now what you see is he's extending this to the church in Rome, that we are all apostles in some sense. Now, he's doing that probably in large part because he wants to connect himself to the official apostles, but we are all disciples. We're all, in some sense, we're followers of Christ. So he's extending that title, kind of the priesthood of all believers. We believe in less of that hierarchy of the priests and the people. And so he's saying, we have received grace, through Christ has given us grace, God has given us grace through Christ, and we have been made apostles or disciples. Why? To bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for the sake of his name. And that phrase, obedience of faith, a sense of calling, a sense of belief, a sense of obedience toward, a sense of response of, among all of the Gentiles. Now that's, for those Jewish Christians, that's a reminder that this is not just a good news for the Jews. But pause for a second, and again, put yourself in the position of a Jew. The whole history is that the God of all of the creation has chosen you to be a part and to be a chosen people and to set apart. And you've been designated, and you've been circumcised, and your families are blessed under this covenant. And and there's a great kingship that comes out of it, and you have this long history and long journey where God has been, this has been just your God. And all of a sudden it's like, well, it's actually for everybody. And so he's bringing that idea of the obedience of faith among all of the Gentiles. So in faith, there's an obedience. And this highlights the providential nature of God. It goes back to the idea, and you're going to see this later in Paul throughout, of the idea that God has chosen us before. Reformers love this whole book because it really sort of undergirds the idea, again, last week I said it, this notion of superlapsarianism, that God has preordained who will be the elect and who will be reprobate, and our obedience is one of obedience and faith. Why? For the sake of Christ's name. And then he says, including yourselves, who are being called to belong to Jesus Christ. And that's there in the sense of there are those in that process. I mean, for a Gentile, again, it's like this is a whole new cosmology. There are, how many of us really, think about, put yourself in that place. How many of you really know, other than who maybe were in the world religions class, how many of you know that much about another religion? And all, like let's say Islam, let's say that was the one true faith, or it was being brought to us as that. Or we don't, I know a little bit. I think the vast majority of us know nothing, to little to nothing. And all of a sudden, that whole structure is being brought before us. It's a lot of new learning. It's a lot of new sort of reconsidering our life and how we think about it. And for that Greco-Roman culture, they would have had a polytheism. They would have had Greek mythology. They would have idols, and Paul goes into that, and idolatry becomes a huge theme in this, not just in the physical sense, but also in the ideological sense. But the sense of idolatry and of other gods and of other places of worship and of other ways of thinking, he's saying, you who are being called, and there's that sense of God is always calling us, but that sense of those who were feeling that tug, and perhaps maybe even reading this for the first time, saying, I feel a little sense of that calling. And we've all been there. Maybe when if you weren't sort of brought up in the church, that sense of first salvation, that sense of first calling. Why do I feel this tug in my heart? Well, this gives us some of that background. And then he goes into, in verse 7, this is, again, the part that gets chopped out in those 14 chapter versions. To all of God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints, meaning saints being set apart, being holy. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, and he blesses them. And people read into that, but I think that's pretty just, in the same way I write blessings at the bottom, sometimes I make them epiphany, I write things around, but it's kind of one of those things that your reading is just something you do. There's a formality in that. Okay, so that's 1 through 7. Anything you want to dig around in there? Anything that stand out? Any of that seem interesting to you?
I had no idea there was that much in verse 1. Just saying.
Well, it's warm, not because
I'm just kind of amazed, Jason, that God picks the people he picks to do what he does. You think of Moses who stuttered, you think of David, a shepherd boy who kills a giant, you think of Paul, a Pharisee, going to try to convert Gentiles.
Yeah.
If you were a Gentile and you thought, this guy was a Pharisee, it amazes me how that God picks certain people.
God uses the most unassuming people, and it gives Christ the most unassuming birth. And I think this is always a reminder in the church as a whole, especially when we see these mega church pastors. And, I was telling someone, my mom, my entire life has said, anytime I had any sort of good thing happen in my life, my mom would always, and bless her for it now, but at the time it was kind of annoying. Pride before downfall. And but I'm thankful for that, because it's always a check. It's always the exaltation, and glorification of Christ over and against us. We are conduits for glorifying God. We are not meant to receive our glory on this earth. And this goes back to that servanthood. Everything that God does is flipping that whole narrative. The whole Bible is a story of human power. The whole story of human history is the story of human power. The whole political scene in our nation, no matter what political party one's is, we're in of every nation in the world, is about human power. in all of this grasp. And why do we grab human power? The short of it is because we want control, because it helps us feel comfortable. It takes away our anxiety. And what God is saying is, none of that matters. Nothing that someone said at this conference I was at, nothing that we do right now in 500 years is going to be remembered or matter. And we're a small blip in the whole span of human life. And sometimes that Ecclesiastes view of sort of leveling and sort of realizing that so much of what we do is vapor. It's not really about the grandiose calling that we have here. It's about the everyday calling we have here to live faithfully in the lives that we have.
I think the main word that I get like through the Gospels is humility.
Humility.
And right at the beginning where it says, well, my book says like.
That's just so
I
they can
did-
hear you, so the
okay.
mic is directed
I
at you.
just
You don't have
think-
to look at it.
Okay,
It's more about miking so that the people online can hear you. No, did you hear that online that she said humility, or was that kind of soft?
humility is my word for Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's the absolute dichotomy of what you're saying with power
Yeah,
and pride.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's how Jesus came in total humility.
yeah. And reversed that. And that's why he's like, I'm not going to acquiesce to the power of Rome. I'm not accountable to you. There's something so much bigger than this. And again, I think that's what we forget this. Like, I forget this. We all forget this. The whole notion that this is not our world is something that all of Western Christianity, 99% of Western Christianity has taken their eyes off of. And we focus on this life too much. And I'm not saying that we can't have comforts in this life. I'm not saying that we can't take care of ourselves. I'm not saying we can't have family and good experience. I mean, I love playing games. What does that have to do with God's kingdom? Well, I have an argument for that too. But in the end of the day, God doesn't want us to be miserable on this earth. We were meant to experience God's blessings and to receive God's blessings. But the minute these blessings go out of whack and they become our focus, then we lose that sense of balance. And that's always going to be the dichotomy between flesh and spirit. We always have to have a primacy of we're first spiritual beings and we're second fleshly material beings. All right, let's get into verse 8. We're going to go 8 through 15. Anyone want to read? Anyone? Nice and loud. Okay, I'm going to turn this to you. There you go.
First,
Nice and loud, so they can hear you here.
First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness, how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now, at last, by God's will, the way may be opened for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I planned many times to come to you, but I've been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I may have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and to the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with verse 8. Unless there's any comments or thoughts right off the bat? Anything standing out to you as that was read? Okay, so first couple of things. One, the tone changes. A little more subdued, a little more casual, a little more conversational. He is starting off. There's a sense of when he says first, he's like, I'm going to go through some stuff that I want to hit on. It has a little bit of a sort of self-statement of I want to come to you. I haven't had time, and the purpose of why he actually wants to go to Rome. Now, he doesn't say anything about Spain here, right, just yet, but he's saying that, and so that's the sort of just overview of what's happening. But let's dig into this. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you. Now, this is a very common thing. It would have been it's really Paul's attempt to say, hey, I care about you. You're siblings in Christ. Because your faith is proclaimed through the world. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ and all of you because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. Now, keep in mind, Paul's understanding of the world was probably no doubt a flat world. The world was in that region. So it was the concept of the world. This is one of the things that we don't consider in our time. I have to talk about how children function. When we mature as adults, we have a bigger sense of the world. Like if I were to say to Silas, the world, where are you at in the world? He doesn't imagine a globe and then like a Google map go and see himself standing on the globe like this, not even, gravity holding his feet to the ground. He sees himself in episodic locations. So it's here, and then there's a lot of wilderness, and then there's Gunnison, or there's Montrose, or there's Grandma's old house, but Silas probably has a dozen places in his life that he holds on to as a part of the world, but has no way to connect those two because sometimes it's by plane, sometimes it's by car, it all looks the same, you just arrive, and his mind maps these locations. Same way Paul he is confining it to the Middle Eastern world that he's in, probably extending down to Northern Africa. He's heard of Spain, never been there, never been to Rome for crying out loud. Most of his life he's probably spent around Jerusalem and Israel, and then now over into the Aegean Sea area and down into Greece. So his world consists of, now, and you might have said in that time, or at least we thought in the West, that was sort of the center of the earth, or they say the Mesopotamia area was the sort of the fertile crescent of the world, where all of civilization came out and it spread from there. And if you believe in the biblical narrative, you would espouse a similar sort of thing, either metaphorically or literally. But there would be some sense of the world stemmed from that. And even though he knows that the world extends, it's more of a flat understanding of the world than it is So he's going out, he's saying that you're known. Rome is known. It's a major powerhouse in the cities that exist. It trumps Corinth and Jerusalem, and maybe you get over to Constantinople, but Rome is a major, this is where it's happening. And so he's saying what's happening, and it's an acknowledgement that prior to even being there were Christians there. He's saying, thank the God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith, their belief, their acceptance of the message of the gospel is being proclaimed. Did you hear? They heard in Rome. There are churches forming in Rome. He's not writing to one little church. He's writing to a collective of people. And it's not like it is today. It's not like, the Vatican's there now, but as you can understand, when you think about how the significance of Rome in this, and then the significance of now for Western Christianity, it is the pinnacle. It's our Mecca. Outside of Jerusalem, there is no other city in Western Christianity that is more important than Rome. Vatican's there, and that's where, Peter established the rock, and so anyway, any thoughts on that? You're like, I didn't know we were going to go through it this deep. But I want you to think about it, because as we make our way through this, you're going to see the book in a very different light, but these are all things that undergird it. Verse 9, for God, whom I serve with my spirit, by announcing the gospel of his Son. So he's saying for God, and God, the Creator God, who he has been employed into this service, proclaiming and announcing the gospel of God, is my witness that without ceasing, so he's saying before God, that's a good claim, that's a strong claim. It's like saying, I vow before God, I swear. He's like, this is not just like before, Ben over here, he saw me praying but without ceasing, I remember you always in my prayers. Now, that's a strong claim, because I got to be honest with you, we've all said, sure, I'll pray for you. I've been praying for you. And sometimes we never even have, if we're really honest with ourselves. I know it happens all the time. It happens to me, and I've been in this business for a long time. Sometimes we say we're praying, we're not. But he's saying, before God, you have been on my heart. He's making a deep, powerful, and profound statement. And again, we live in a culture so littered with words that we don't take them into deep consideration, whereas when you have fewer words, imagine your world, you only have a few statements or a few written things, the gravity of those you would take much more. So he is making a pretty strong claim that he is going, without ceasing, I remember you in my prayers, asking that by God's will, that I may somehow at last succeed in coming to you. He wants to come to them. He longs to come to them. It's meant for the hearer to say, oh, this is the important apostle. He wants to be with us. It's kind of like if someone famous is coming to Lake City, we're like, yeah, he wants to be here. She wants to be here. It's a good thing. 11, for I am longing to see you so that I may share with you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. What is the spiritual gift? Well, we're going to find out. So we'll leave that as a foreshadowing of yet that was yet to come, or rather, so that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. So this is interesting, because most of the time Paul comes in as the leader, and then there's the students or the churches, and he's there to guide and lead. But he doesn't know Rome. They don't know him. Other than by reputation, he has no relationship. He hasn't established. They could be looking at, this is back, there's the verses, I think in Corinthians said, some follow Apollos, some follow Rome, or Paul. There are people who followed different apostles. Some followed Peter. Some were Johannian, some were Matthean. Everyone had their own sort of leader they followed. It wasn't if Paul ruled the roost. Now Paul rules the roost to some extent in modern day Protestantism, but that wasn't the case here. So he's establishing some sense of equity. We can both encourage each other. I'm going to tell you what God's been doing over here around the Aegean Sea, and you get to tell me what God's been doing in Rome. And we can be encouraged that the message of the gospel is being shared.
So is it spiritual gift encouragement?
The spiritual gift, I would say, is the Spirit, gifts of the Spirit, and it comes in multiple forms. I wouldn't say it's a gift, a particular thing. I mean, that would be, I think, short-sighted, but we don't know exactly. So some might argue, I doubt many, but some might argue there's one specific gift or that it was encouragement. I would make the argument the gift is the Spirit, and the Spirit manifests itself in multiple ways. But the idea of the spiritual gift is the gift of perhaps even presence. It's spiritual, they're present with one another, and I think encouragement is a part of that. I want you to know, and my version says brothers and sisters. That's a modern day translation. The original would have said brothers, and that's not to say that the men in that scene or the Rome were more important than the women. It would be to say that in a first century world, Jesus was just on the scene 30 years ago. And think about how, we live in a time of rapid change. Things have changed very slowly then. And that's what made some of the things about the New Testament church so radical. In particular, when he names Phoebe as being a leader and a deacon. Phoebe? Yeah. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, but he's speaking to the church, and I think that the church is implied. He would have been implying you and your household in the church, not just the men, just to be clear. That I want you to know, brothers, that I have, or brothers and sisters, I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. And so he's saying, I want to come labor with you. He's saying that God has blessed my ministry. I've reaped the harvest. There's some debate of whether that the reaping that is that the reaping of those of Jews coming in, or is it or is it Gentiles? I would say it's probably Gentiles, as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. So it's not saying that I reap some Gentile harvest among you as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. It's saying I reap some harvest among you as I have. So it could mean in his work in the Aegean Sea among the Gentiles, he wants the same type of effectiveness. But he's speaking to both a Jewish and a Greek or Jewish and Gentile audience. So in general, I would say it's probably just safe. He's saying that to bring people to Christ, to have them come to faith and to have them understand. He's coming with a sense of purpose. And verse 14, I am a debtor both to Greeks and to the barbarians, and both to wise and to the foolish. And he does this. Paul, all over Romans, is going to do a dichotomy. And he's going to mention Greeks, he's going to mention Jews, he's going to remember barbarians, he's going to mention Gentiles. He uses a lot of language. There is some debate about what what the notion of barbarians means, in terms of he's not actually talking, about like our modern day view of a barbarian. It more implies those who are uneducated, those who are the Greeks are considered an educated, intellectually affluent perhaps, but an educated culture. There's a system or a knowledge there. Barbarians would be those who would have been in the uneducated category, not like, carrying around, Conan the Barbarian sort of thing. Both of the wise, again, the Greek wisdom, acknowledgement of the wisdom that they would have said in Greco-Roman college, they would have looked at the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, the philosophers, as being wise. And perhaps those who didn't contain that sapientia, that Greek knowledge, that Greek wisdom, as foolish. Verse 15, hence my eagerness to proclaim the gospel to you who are also in Rome. And essentially what he's saying is, I've been doing this work and I want to come join you in the labors you're doing. I hear that God's doing something great there. I want to hear those. I want to be encouraged by that. I want to encourage you about what God's doing. He's trying to establish this sort of connection between them all. Okay.
Jason?
Yeah.
Jason?
Yes.
What was the population of Rome? Because I would have thought they were Roman, but now he's talking about Greeks and the barbarian. Was it just a mixture of all different cultures?
No, it would have. In any metropolitan area, that era, Corinth would have been both Greek and Roman, because basically you had Roman rule and then you had Greek rule, and they, the whole notion of Hellenization, Greek culture would have influenced all of it. So you had this clash between Greek and Latin culture, or in Western culture, and you would have had that there as well. But in general, there's a lot of overlap between the way they view, which is why we often talk about Greco-Roman culture. In the same way we talk about Judeo-Christian faith. Anytime in that period, you would have had an intermingling. The New Testament is a Greco-Roman book. There are Roman influences in all of these writings, and there are Greek influences in all of these writings. And we can't talk about Christianity outside of Greek and Rome. You can't. It's not there. It's not present. Everything about the New Testament is written in the culture. And in fact, all of the New Testament books written in Greek, and that's how pervasive it was. And it would have absolutely reached Rome. So there would have been, now that doesn't mean that someone's like, I'm Greek, I'm Roman, and they're just finding themselves, or I'm Italian. They didn't have that then, but that sort of, cultural tension, it wasn't as divided. These days, I know there's a debate over, maybe some countries are trying to take over the other, but in general, our lines are drawn. Although I did meet some guy from Upper Peninsula, Michigan. We had a long discussion the past couple of days about why that should really be Wisconsin, and we should, what a stupid looking state. Anyway, topic for another day. Any other comments on that?
When it says wise and foolish, this particular version says wise and unwise.
And unwise. Yeah, and honestly, I think the term fool, I know we can call a jester foolish or something like that, or, we use the word foolish in other way, but actually to name someone a fool was a pretty significant thing. And it doesn't just mean uneducated, it probably, the levels of rationality in humanity are different. The levels of critical thinking are different. And that doesn't say that every human being doesn't have the capacity, maybe if they were raised differently, but there's a spectrum of everything. There's a spectrum of education, there's a spectrum of natural capacity. There are some people who just aren't deep thinkers, and there's some people who are incredibly deep thinkers. And so he's covering the gambit. Paul does this all over the place. It's that either or, and it's that, you'll see that all over the place. Flesh, spirit, Greek, he always with one or the other. And chances are, I'll say that in the midst of this, as much as I think it's either or, one or the other, there is also in between. Okay, 16 to 17 stands as its own. It's kind of like this statement that it comes into play. And I love it. This first statement, for it starts in 16, says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. And we'll stop there. I am not ashamed of the gospel. And that's we hear that. We've heard that in church all our lives, not ashamed of the gospel. And you see it on banners. Maybe you see it on a t-shirt somewhere. Quite frankly, if you were ashamed of the gospel, I would say that probably means you're not really in the faith. A heathen would say, I'm ashamed. I don't want to be a part of that. That's nonsense to me. Paul, and so to some extent, there's part of me, and as I read that, like, why would Paul want to say that? But other than the fact that there's an acknowledgement, again, first century Christians, a lot of them were Jews. And a lot of them, probably within the context, it's not like they were like, oh, you just told me the story about who Jesus is. Let's giddy up. Let me join up. Where do I sign up? We're all done with Judaism. Let's move on to this new thing. That's not at all the wrestling between what it meant to be a Jewish Christian. Because in some sense, they didn't see it as transitioning from Judaism to Christianity. This was a new Judaism. This was the true remnant of faith coming out. And there would have been some sense of perhaps, I suppose you could say that today, the sense of I still have a Jewish family, and just because one person came to faith in Christ doesn't mean their family did, doesn't mean their parents did.
Jason, was this before the Christians were being persecuted in Rome?
I don't know the date on the Colosseum, but no, overall before the major persecution.
Okay. They were semi-persecuted all the way through, the Christians, whenever they broke off from the Jewish, weren't they?
Yeah, there was persecution just 5 years previous towards the Jews just alone, because they were, in part because of this debate, and so there was
maybe
tension.
That's the reason that he put, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, writing to them in Rome. I didn't know.
Well, I think there probably were, that's what I'm saying, is there were some who came to faith who were ashamed, and they probably didn't want to share, they weren't sure, there's a lot of Christians in the US probably who are like that. If you really pressed them, they'd be like, well, I don't know, I don't want to talk about this. Sounds kind of kooky, maybe So, there is, and so he's saying, I'm not ashamed, as a Jew, I'm not ashamed. I'm bold with this. I'm bringing it to the table. And that's not a condemnation of those who are. He's just making with clear certainty that he is not ashamed of the gospel. It is by the very power of God. It is the power of God. And again, this notion and mention of power will be a theme also running through the book of Romans, and it's usually in juxtaposition to the power of Rome. There would have been the emperor was all through history, but in particular around this time would have been a major power. And what they're contrasting is earthly power of Rome with an emperor in this mighty city, with the power of God that has the history and testimony of Israel, that's saying, no, this is the power of God, is the one that lit the altar that was doused in water, the one that split the sea and allowed the Israelites to escape captivity. Salvation for everybody who has faith. And that's a bold statement, because he's saying, he's equating the gospel with the inclusion of all people. And so in a very mixed Jewish Gentile church in Rome, he's making certain that he's saying he's not ashamed, that the gospel that he's preaching is for everybody. Just so he doesn't come there and the Jews are like, oh, you're one of us. And he's like, no, it's not. We're neither new Jew nor Gentile. But he says, who has faith, to the Jews first, and then also to the Greek. And he says Greek, but that could be true. That could be understood as Gentile. When you see Greek, Gentile, Gentile obviously is a larger category, but that's what he's expressing. And again, that shows the prominence of the Greek culture at the time. But first to the Jews, and that goes back to, this is the history of the Jews. This is the notion of first shall be last, last shall be first. The Jews were first, and then the Gentiles. And so we'll be first and then the Jews are going to follow up. And again, I think in my head that goes back to, we are coming into salvation now. Many Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah, but when Jesus returns in all of the glory of his second coming, will come in such that those Jews who are present as representation of the Jews of history, and those who are dead in Christ or will come to a recognition of who Jesus. But the Jews were first reconciled by faith, and then also the Greeks. So 17, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. So what that's pointing to is, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed. No human has been righteous, fully righteous. We can't attain that ourselves, not by works, not by merit, not by anything we do. The righteousness of God, that means that the reason that we are named righteous is not because of us, but because God's righteousness imputed to us by faith in Jesus Christ. And this is an important theme throughout all of Romans. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, i.e. the Jews, for faith, i.e. the Gentiles. As it is written, the one who is righteous, the Jews, will live by faith. And they have lived by faith that God was their God. They had lived, and that doesn't mean it wasn't perfect. Our faith isn't perfect. Their faith isn't perfect. And that's why when Christians start condemning Jews, I'm like, well, that's a dangerous ground, man. You're walking on some, I just think if there's nothing that I could communicate to you out of this entire study is that all of us here are by the grace of God. And when we start to really wrestle and consider what it means to be all of us existing in the grace of God, all of us being fallen, all of us having faults, all of us, and God looking down on all of us despite our wickedness, and when we get into later this year, when we get into the whole sin thing, we'll talk about the different levels and all those things, the way we think about it. But in the end of the day, none of us, no one is without sin, which means everyone is guilty. And that is an important thing to understand, and Paul gets into that as well. Okay, that's the first half. Does anyone want to make any comments? Any thoughts? Okay, let's get into the second half. I'm just going to go ahead and read section by section, just to kind of move through, if that's okay. Just because I was looking at the time, all of a sudden, I didn't really realize we were going to. The message of all before we read this passage, it is very easy to cherry pick. And this is what the church is doing right now, and has done in various ways. But what is important is to take from 18 to 32 as a section that is communicating this message. We are all sinners. We are all idolaters. Not adulterers, idolaters. Meaning that we create idols. Now the Jews created idols that were, and he talks about this, that fashioned in earthly sort of things. We do that too to some extent. Maybe it's homes, maybe it's cars, maybe it's game collections, maybe it's Facebook. Maybe it's our sense of likes on Facebook. Maybe it's a sense of hedonism, our desire for pleasure, desire and again, this goes back to that whole balance thing. I think Paul says everything in moderation means everything in balance. God has given us, there are lots of things. God has given us food. If you starve yourself and don't eat and you're withering away, well, that's not what God designed for us. If you're indulging yourselves in constantly just celebrating all the food and that's just your whole life, that's out of balance. In the midst of all of that, regardless of where you're on that spectrum, though, it is all part of our fallenness. Even if you find balance, you still find yourself in that fallenness. And it's important, and especially when the division, we don't think of it, you might put it in a conservative liberal thing today, in terms of the way in American Christianity we talk about it, but he's talking about Jews and Gentiles. Either way, they're spectrums, one side or the other. And what he's trying to do is say, none of y'all, none of us, no one in this earth, no one who's ever lived on this earth can claim any sense of being set apart for their own doing. And he's going to make the argument that it all comes through God. Okay, let's go through verse by verse. For the wrath of God, and it's important to note that God has wrath. It's right there. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. This is a sense that says, and as this is talking about it, this is not necessarily Jews, this is not Gentile, this is humanity as a whole. Don't think of it as like this is the Jews doing, this is across the board. You could say almost this was pre-Abraham, that what Paul's trying to make an established case for. For the wrath of God is revealed in heaven against all ungodliness, anything that is not like God, all wickedness, that which is the opposite of righteousness, of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. So there's a suppression of the truth of who God is. And the desire is, in the suppression of God, who God is because, and before God, we're held accountable. Before ourselves, we're not. And therefore, we can do what we want. And so what we do often, and what he's making an argument is, suppressing the very notion of the divine justifies our wickedness, because if there is no divine, who really cares? We're in a world of nihilism. You can do whatever you want. If there's no right or wrong, if there's no righteousness or wickedness, if that's just all a construct of our mind, then why not live for the fullness of your own hedonism? Why not live for your? And we could go back and say, well, that's and in some even in the animal kingdom, you don't see that. You don't see one animal being like, screw the rest of you cheetahs. I guess they're isolated beings. Forget the rest of you. I'm going to go do my own thing. There's always a sense of of connectivity in the animal kingdom. Well, not always, but I mean, in a lot of cases, humans are the same way too. If you're off on your own, then you're going to survive by yourself. We discovered very quickly on, probably in early stages of humanity, that when we collaborate, we can actually do things better. And it has just got more and more, now look at globalization. We're all collaborating on everything.
And actually, we did a lot of study when we were doing high performance teams and found that the tribe instinct, I'm going to call it that, is the strongest instinct we have.
It has to be for sustenance. For sustainability.
Yeah.
Where's your safety? Your safety is in numbers. I mean, 2 people out there is less safe than 20.
Yeah.
If you've watched the Walking Dead, anyone watch that show? Like, that's the whole notion of that. If you're off on your own, even if you have a sword with you, you're going to get outpowered. If you're with group, you can protect one another. There's something about that idea. 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. And this goes back to first parents, first God consciousness. I think that there was still in Adam and Eve some sense of God consciousness, some sense of awareness. It wasn't as if they got kicked out of the garden and they immediately lost that God consciousness. There was a realization that what they had done had changed their cosmology, changed their metaphysics, perhaps, in my ideas. But they're ushered into the world, but there's still a sense of who God was. God was the divine creator. Now, that would have minimized or maybe really become reduced throughout the time and space. But 20 goes on with the same thought. For ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, hold on to that, invisible though they are, because you can't necessarily see them, they're characteristics that aren't something that you can like grab it like a glass, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they're saying you see his eternal power and you see his divine nature through the created order. Through the things that they have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So, and that would include probably in an Adam and Eve sort of literal sense, the walking in the garden, the provision, the divine power of creation and the myriad animals that were created and all these things. There's a sense of, in the same way we walk up on the mountains, you feel like you're surrounded by God's handiwork. And now, even now, I challenge you to find I'm sure there's probably one or two, but someone who is a molecular biologist or a chemist, those people who dig at the very micro understanding of the world, most of them, they might be Christians, but they acknowledge some divine source. They get down to the masterful creation of that, and there's just an acknowledgement of, it's just brilliant. It just didn't happen. And that's and again, it's even for scientists, it's a face statement. They probably wouldn't put that in a paper. But time and time again, you hear stories and you see scientists who will acknowledge, and those who observe it on that level, it really comes into play.
Jason?
Yeah.
That explains also why primitive cultures have developed origin myths that have some kind of a creator figure.
Yep.
Their stories aren't the same as our Genesis account, but they do, many of them, I've read a number of them, and many of them have a sort of parallel to the Genesis account.
I would say almost every one of them. I mean, as we study world religions, almost every one of them have some notion of a creator or divine. It isn't until I mean, I don't even remember the phrase, but it's the idea of the denial of God didn't even enter into people's minds until we made ourselves gods, until there was a place where we reached a level of rationality where we believed that we could outthink God. And then, it's probably around, and I would guess many would say that happened during the Enlightenment. Not that there probably haven't been people throughout history who might have jumped on that bandwagon or postulated that, but it doesn't become an intellectual or a sort of a thought category until, I don't want to say Nietzsche because there are precursors before that, but Nietzsche certainly was a point where he's like, God's a construction. But that was also the time where the notion of a philosopher king, that one person could rise in their intellectual pursuits so far above the others that they would operate as a puppet master rather than on the level of humanity as itself. So they're without excuse. End of verse 20. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. And so there's a denial of God's divine presence. There's a denial, almost like it's like a so focused on the earth that you lose sight of the grand, the larger. They became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. So not only did they have senseless minds, not only they were without light, not only were they missing some of it, but there's a sense of darkness there, and a sense almost, and I would say that darkness is not just an absence, but an actually sort of giving oneself to the denial of who God is, or a rejection, or an acknowledgement of God's presence there. 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools. Again, not a lighthearted word in biblical times. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal human beings or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. And what you have there is a exemplification of the created order. In other words, the very things that God created became the very thing that they perceived God through, and they both exalted man in that regard. And you have these sort of things that are half man, half God, half animal. But the idea is they rejected the idea of the divine for the sake of something eminent, something in the earth, something material, something present. And they fashioned it out of the depths of their understanding of the world, which would have been physical forms. And they didn't understand all the things we understand. They didn't even know those things existed. They just had images or symbols, and those symbols were associated with, certain things. Obviously, certain animals were associated with certain things, and you see this in Israel, and he's referring back, even to times. But before Israel was a people, there were gods. You look at all those other nations, there's God. Some of them carried on. In Hinduism, they had gods. Therefore, and this is where it gets challenging. Therefore, therefore God gave them up in their lusts of heart to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, for who is blessed forever. Amen. So he's making a point there. And this is the heart of this passage right here. We exchange the truth of who we believe and know, in particular in this day and age, but back then it would have been like they wouldn't have the Spirit with them. But they're exchanging the little knowledge, the knowledge they had of an understanding of a Creator God, the knowledge they've been given understanding of this divine being over, and they basically rejected it and saying, this is all it is. This is all it is. And if this is all it is, again, when I said a little bit earlier, then why not give in to your hedonistic desires? Why not get into the desires of the flesh? Because if you don't believe there's something bigger, or if you believe that the fashioned God that you're worshiping is a God, and it's not even really in the sense of the grand sense, it's in the sense of a smaller deity or something, but they're worshiping the very things that is created. Now, we do this too. We do this all the time. We worship, think about what you worship is what you spend time, what you adore, we do this all the time. We worship money. In our culture, in Western culture, we worship security. We worship belongings and possessions, and these are all things, we worship power. And he's saying that they've exchanged those things. And now what I want to say before this next section, 26 and 27, is explicitly about homosexuality. And then he goes on and he lists a number of other things that fall into the category of idolatry, of making idols, of making, again, the prioritization of the earth. But what he's doing is he's highlighting here something that falls into the category of betraying God in place of an earthly existence and an earthly pleasure. And he's saying, because this goes back to the created order. They would have had Genesis, and they would have had the commandment that God gave them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. God made them male and female for the purposes of procreation. Now this dips a little bit into my understanding, and I'll explain it in this way, of sexuality. I think that sex existed in the terms of procreation prior to the fall. I think that if we look at an animal kingdom, for example, cows mate, monkeys mate, mammals mate, non-mammals. I mean, there's a sense of male-female procreation. It is a natural compatibility for the purpose. And I'm not saying there's not deviation. I'm not saying there's not some weirdness. I know praying mantises eat the guy's head. There's all sorts of little things in there. I'm not focusing on those. I'm saying as a natural order, even in the plant world, there's a sense of male-female compatibility for the purposes of procreation, for the purposes of extension. It's not a one-time thing. And the idea in the divine covenant that God gave both Adam and Eve and Noah, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. God wanted to expand civilization, expand creation. And so what you have in this notion is now God is giving an example of that which does not fulfill that divine covenant. I believe sexuality entered into the world in the fall, the way we understand it. God said to the woman, your desires shall be for the man, and he will rule over you. Not only is that patriarchy, which would have happened in a material world where men were bigger than women, and they were going to, and if safety is the concern and threat from wild animals is the concern, you're going to go to those who can provide protection for that. But I think where it says your desire will be for the man, I always say, what was woman's desire before that? Was it a sexual desire? I think that the desire for one another, and what you have is you go from a self-giving space. If the image of God in Adam and Eve represents the self-giving nature of the Trinity, that perichoresis, that dance around, the Trinity we say is always in a self-giving thing. That's just like the self-giving is the generator. And we were invited into that dance, and Adam and Eve are in this self-giving space. And then they're thrust into the world where all of a sudden self-preservation for fear of death becomes the primary goal of the day. And again, going back to that's why we collected in groups, because there was safety and preservation in that. So when you take that notion of pre-fall of self-giving and you put it into a self-preserving or self-gratifying, you also take sexuality that was meant to be self-giving for the purposes of procreation. Perhaps maybe not with maybe it was pleasurable, maybe it wasn't. I can't speak to that. I wasn't there. But I know that the purposes of procreation or the purposes of sex was designed for procreation, for the expansion of humanity. I think there's actually more of a naturalistic argument against the idea of homosexuality than there is sometimes a theological one, because if you take our genitalia with their purposes for procreation, then homosexuality doesn't achieve that, because it doesn't lead to procreation, and therefore it is an affront in this writing to the divine mandate, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Now with those ears, hear this. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Degrading passions. That means maybe the hint that there was some sense of passion. Maybe there was still pleasure in there. Degrading passion says you've misappropriated the passions that I've designed to give you for the procreation, and now they're in a place where these passions that you're desiring don't lead to anything other than the fulfillment of the passion itself. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also, their men giving up their natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received their own persons the due penalty for their, and in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And that could have been ostracization, it could have been death, it could have been punishment, it could have been why are you doing that. But what this is pointing to is if you understand sex as being for, and this is where I actually do agree with the Catholic Church, the purposes of sex is not first and foremost pleasure. It's not self-gratification. It's not for you. The purpose, the primary essence of sexuality, of sex, not sexuality, sex is procreation, to produce an offspring for the propagation, for the fulfillment of the divine covenant. And so the results of that, none of that would have affected them, and they would have been, experienced the effects of that. But this means that what Paul is arguing here is the focus on the self-gratifying nature of their sexuality was placed over and against the divine covenant that God made with humanity: be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Now, here's my issue with this. This is an example. But I think in the heterosexual world that we live in, heterosexuals are just as guilty of exchanging the very essence of what God created sex for the sake of our own gratification and hedonism. I am not suggesting that you can't have, I'm going to speak very frankly here, a self-giving, maybe even 99% self-giving way of engaging in a sexual relationship with someone. But I know without a question that everyone in this room and everyone online and everyone in the world who has ever engaged in a sexual activity was not in 100% state of self-giving mindset in such a way that it was about giving of oneself to the other for the fulfillment of the divine covenant. I also would suggest that anytime we dress up sex in any way, that means of putting lingerie on a woman or a man, whatever you might want to do, anything you do. I mean, you know what? And there's a lot of liberties that we give ourselves as heterosexuals in this world to dress up sex, to make it more exciting, that I think fall into the category of unnatural. I'll say it right here. This is not an issue of sin or not sin. This is an issue of design and not design. I don't think God designed us to engage in oral sex. I think that is that falls into this category, an unnatural act. An act, quite frankly, if it wasn't for the last 2 centuries of the evolution of hygiene, I don't think that was probably as much of a conversation. But what this represents is a misappropriation for the design that the Creator God gave humanity sex for the purpose of procreation, of filling the earth. Now, the Catholic Church says first and foremost procreation. They align their view of sexuality with that. Second is union. And that comes into Paul's understanding of the relationship between the husband and the wife and Christ and the church, union. And that's why it's important and Paul even says, those who are weak, they consider those who need to be married, who need to gratify those sexual desires. So in some sense, Paul sort of hints back to the fact that the desires that we feel sexually are not natural even in and of themselves. They're part of the fall. They're part of our brokenness, and they're part of needs that we have that in the afterlife will not be there. And I will go ahead and assert that in a direct field. I do not think we will have a sense of sexuality in the afterlife. One, we won't need to procreate because we won't need to fill anything unless God changes it up. The elect is the elect, and we're just going to be there. So what's the purpose? And and if God wants to institute some sort of sex there for pleasure, then that's God's design. But there's no indication of that, because the fullness of God's presence with relationship to us will surpass any earthly pleasure. So what you have here is Paul taking, and maybe, and honestly, in Greco-Roman culture, it's not surprising if you know anything about the Greeks. There was homosexuality, there was pedophilia. There was all sorts of expressions. Just like people experiment sexually today, they would have experimented then. But what Paul ultimately is saying is not condemning. But so, and now let's jump over here for a second to say, people often say, well, what is sin? I remember asking this as a teenager. If I touch a girl's breast, if I touch my girlfriend's breast, is that sin? Did I commit? Just on a practical level, if you strip away God, if you strip touching someone's body on a certain way, just, I mean, like, it's skin contact. Oral sex is skin contact. I mean, like, there are things that happen within sexuality. A man having sex with a man is pleasure, there's a pleasure. There is a self-gratification there. A woman engaging in sexual activity with a woman, there's pleasure there. That's not denying there's not pleasure there, but that pleasure is geared towards the satisfaction of our earthly essence. And as Paul's going to unfold this, we're not meant to focus on our earthly pleasure. We're meant to keep that in check. And I think the Catholic Church, quite frankly, does that way better than Protestantism. And it's something that I've journeyed through in my own life to understand that a Catholic view of sexuality says procreation, and if you're not doing that, union. And that doesn't mean it can't be pleasurable. It means that it's not, if the design is, I just want to fulfill my sexual urges, then it misses the whole sacredness of the very gift of sexuality that God has given a fallen humanity. And this is an example of that, not an uplifting of this being any greater. And in fact, God mentions the next section in these sins far more in Scripture than he does sexuality or homosexuality. So take this as an example, an exemplification, perhaps something they were dealing with in Rome at the time, something that they could relate to. And then, so with that mindset of us exchanging the very covenant of sex for the purposes of procreation and the fulfillment of the divine covenant, in exchange of something that does not do that, but still gratifies that desire, that is an example of idolatry. We make an idol of our own pleasure.
Self-gratification.
Self-gratification. And if you've heard anything from me, this ain't our world. These aren't our bodies. We are Paul the servant. Denial of self. Putting things in check. And I've said this to some of you, just to say where I stand on all of this. Do I think homosexuality is natural? No. Do I think it's biological? Yes. Do I think it falls into the category of our broken in sinfulness? Yes. Do I think our expressions of heterosexuality fall into the category of broken in sinfulness? Yes. Why don't I condemn homosexuals? Why am I okay with the inclusion of them in the church? Is because I have to wrestle with my own understanding of sexuality, as many as of you have. What does sexuality mean? What is my expression? What is reasonable? And I would make the argument that most Christians in this world, I mean, forget the non-Christians, but those who try to hold a standard of what sexuality is in a Christian marriage, is that any time that we use sex for our own personal gain, for our own satisfaction, outside of the notion of union. This is why marriage is important, because there's meant to be a representation of Christ in the body. We all engage in the sinfulness of the fallenness of our sexuality. And I think heterosexuals are far more guilty of that than homosexuals. And until we sort our stuff out, I think it's very dangerous to point a finger, because I think we will be held far more accountable for our own brokenness than for this. Now, I could be wrong, and God may judge us all pretty harshly on that, or God may extend grace on all of that. But I'll say this, I have lots of homosexual friends in my life who are Christians, who are ministers, who are in covenanted marital relationships, and they are monogamous, and they are some of the most holy people I know, who give their lives to the service of the kingdom. And I believe that God, at the end of the day, God's going to judge how God's going to judge. But what I can tell you this is the fingers that we point at the homosexual community today only put ourselves in more danger of condemnation from God for our own sexualities. So that is my argument to say we need not point our fingers. That doesn't mean we say it's okay. It doesn't mean we have to condone. But I also think it's very dangerous to condemn. And you can say, oh, it's right there. Well, let's look at the next passage as we close this out. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to the debased mind, the things that should not be done. And it didn't start with homosexuality. It's all inclusive. You could drop it down there. They were filled with every kind of, and as I say these, I want you to raise your hand if you're guilty. Just kidding. Every kind of wickedness. That's a lot. That covers everything. Evil. We've all been there. Covetousness. You ever covet? Malice. You ever had malice? Ever had anger? Full of envy. You ever been envious of someone? Murder. Hopefully no one's done that. And if you did, don't tell me about it. Strife. Well, that seems kind of low level. Like strife? Really? You just deceit. Uh-oh. Now we're getting into some everyday stuff. Craftiness. How many of us have been manipulative in our own lives? Gossips. Holy cow. The Lake City gossip train is like none other than I have ever experienced. Slanderers. Ever slander someone? Yep. God haters, maybe not here, but maybe not. I don't know. Insolent, surely. Haughty, absolutely. Boastful, 100%. Inventors of evil. Have we ever invented evil? Have we brought darkness? Have we ever done anything that has brought evil into this world? Certainly. Rebellious towards parents. I don't know a single human being who hasn't been rebellious towards their parents. Foolish, faithless, heartless. And you're like, hey, these are getting kind of every day now. Like, ruthless. They know God's decrees, and we know God's decrees. We know what God calls us to. That those who practice such things deserve to die. Dirty, rotten sinners. And yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Celebration of the hedonistic life that we all live in. This is not placing homosexuality in any stretch of the imagination. You see that in comparisons throughout Scripture. And to say that it is held above would be a dangerous exegetical jump that I would caution against. What I'm saying is and it doesn't even mention lust in there, and that's what it's kind of encompassing in that lust. But what Paul is establishing is our brokenness is pervasive. We are all fallen, and anyone who says one sin is greater than the other over and against has taken and put themselves in the place of God's judge, to be the judge for God, and that's a dangerous seat to sit in.
Which is the very first line of verse 2.
Of verse 2, where?
Yeah, the very first line. If you think you can judge others, you are wrong.
Yes. Now, this is meant to establish from the very beginning, we're all sinners and we're all fallen. And this is the message of the gospel, that no matter what you do, that you're covered. God's grace that comes through Paul's writings to the Romans is like none other. But in order to enter and to receive and to understand that grace, you can't go in with pointing a finger at anyone. Because the minute we point a finger at anyone for anything, we got 3 fingers. I'm just kidding. 3 fingers pointing back at you. Father, Son, and Spirit. That's not, I just made that up. We put ourselves in a place of judgment. We put ourselves in a place of condemnation. Jesus didn't come into the world to condemn it. He came into the world to reveal light, so that we might be reconciled to God. And the first step to that true sense of reconciliation, of salvation, of justification, comes through the recognition that we have all fallen short of God's glory. And that is the wholeness of what Paul is talking about. And for us to take any single one of those, he could have taken any one of these things and gossip, and he could have given an example of gossip, and it would have fallen into that same category. Just because Paul chose to use something that perhaps was pervasive at that time does not mean that it is held above or over or a sense of a deeper sin. And that's the problem, is we take this and we do that. And that's the current rhetoric of today around this. I'm not justifying that exchange of relations. What I'm saying is all of these are meant to describe everyone. And when we begin to enter this book with the posture of we're all broken, we're all fallen, then we'll truly experience the grace of God in the whole book of Romans.
Forgive and don't judge.
Forgive and don't judge. God's the ultimate judge. And until we sorted our junk out, We perhaps, and that's the message of the gospel, is we can't, unless you have a doctrine of perfectionism, which I don't, so. All right, next week we'll begin with chapter 2. Wrestle with that. If you want to talk more, I am available. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to help you journey spiritually. If this is something you want to talk for, schedule an appointment with me before next Wednesday, and we'll talk more. I'm happy to dig into this a little bit more. So, okay, that's all we have for today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.